Hi guys, Craig here and welcome back to my YouTube channel. So in today's video we're going to be talking about the killer clown, or as he's more commonly known, John Wayne Gacy. But before I get into today's video, please remember to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. And make sure that you hit that bell icon to be notified every time I upload a new video. And please remember that these videos are made for educational purposes only, and to create a discussion point around a certain topic. I never mean any disrespect to the victims or their families. So let's begin. On December 23rd, 1978, the Chicago police, who had been investigating the disappearance of several boys for months, finally found them. They knew that the boys were probably dead, but they weren't expecting to find them all rotten and buried in mass graves underneath a house in a neighbourhood where bad things never happen. The police went in for one boy, but came out with 29 bodies, and a few days later that number grew to 33. It was an unbelievable sight, and still one that sends shivers down everyone's spine almost 50 years later. John Wayne Gacy lived in the safe little town of Norridge, Chicago. He was an only son and had two sisters. His early life was pretty troubled. His father was abusive towards Gacy's mother, and this abuse eventually bled into the kids as well. They recalled their father taunting John time and time again, calling him a mama's boy, adding that just because he was close to his mother, he would probably grow up gay. Abuse affects different people in different ways. Even though Gacy's father was absolutely horrible, he still tried hard to impress him, but nothing ever came close. John Wayne Gacy was just never good enough for his father. This led him to try and seek validation from outside sources. At the age of 18, he got into politics. He was working as the assistant captain for the Democratic Party candidate from Norridge in the 1960s. But this just made his behaviour of his father even worse. It was like it was going to be impossible for him to ever impress him. So it was around this time that things started to take a turn. Gacy moved to Las Vegas while he was in his early 20s, and he was working in the ambulance service. But after just a few months, he was transferred over to the mortuary instead. There, he worked as a mortuary attendant. His work was to basically take care of the morgue. He didn't really have anything to do with the bodies, that came to the morticians. Yet, John Wayne Gacy was always interested, and always watching. Gacy also lived in the morgue, sleeping in a bed right behind the embalming room. And for 3 months straight, he studied the morticians embalming the bodies and getting them ready for their funerals. But that isn't all that he did. At one point, once the morticians had wrapped up for the day and transferred the body of a boy into his coffin, John Wayne Gacy got out of bed, climbed into that coffin with the boy's body, and caressed and hugged it for hours. Eventually, realising what he was doing was wrong, he jumped out and called his mom and asked her if he could move back in. His mother agreed, and Gacy made his way back to Norridge, where he stayed for a while just until he got his life in order. Once he moved back with his mum, he went to college and graduated with a business degree, and then went on to work in sales for a short while. While he did that, he met a woman called Marilyn Myers, and the two got engaged just a few weeks later. And by September of 1964, they were married. Marlon's father had just bought multiple KFC franchises. He made an offer to Gacy that he just couldn't refuse. He wanted him to move to Waterloo in Iowa with him and Marlon and help him run the KFCs. He even offered to empty out a house so that they could live in it. So he'd have a nice place to live, a steady job, and a salary of $15,000 a year, and he could even take a share of the restaurant's profits. This was an offer that he couldn't refuse, so the two moved to Waterloo to begin their perfect life. But this is when John Wayne Gacy began abusing his position of power. He opened up an employees club in his basements where the employees of his restaurants could come and hang out and drink alcohol. Most of the people that Gacy would hire would be teenage boys. He'd invite them over, get them drunk, and then try to make sexual advances towards them. If they tried to say no, he would either tell them that he was joking or that he was testing their morals. Either way, he ran a tight web of manipulation. John Wayne Gacy and his first wife had 2 children over the next few years. A son in February of 1966 and a daughter in March of 1967. It was as if his family was now complete. He was living the dream. It wasn't until you looked closer inside that you seen how messed up things really were. In August of 1967, Gacy lured a college boy, 15-year-old Donald Voorhees, to his home. He told him that he would let him watch porn films at his house. And when Donald got there, Gacy gave him loads of alcohol and did indeed let him watch the porn films. Later, he manipulated him into engaging in oral sex with him. He told him that you would have to have sex with a man before you could ever have sex with a woman, making him believe that this is how it worked. When this plan worked for Gacy, he continued doing this to several other boys. He even made some of them believe that Gacy himself was a commissioned officer who was legally allowed to conduct homosexual experiments to learn more about them. He'd even pay some of the boys $50 bills for participating in this experiment. In March of 1978, 7 months after Donald was taken advantage of, he finally broke down and told his father what had happened. His father immediately filed a report against Gacy, but Gacy, in an attempt to silence Donald, paid a boy named Russell, an 18-year-old that worked for him, to attack Donald, and that is what he'd done. But Donald identified him to the police and he was arrested too. And it didn't take long for Russell to rat out John Wayne Gacy. On November 7th, 1968, Gacy pled guilty for sodomizing Donald, but got away with pleading not guilty for all the other boys that he had molested in the past few months. He was sentenced to serve 10 years in prison, but only ended up serving 18 months before getting parole. During his imprisonment, his wife divorced him and took the kids and left town. The only conditions on Gacy's release was that he had to go back to Chicago and back to living with his mother. He also had to adhere to a strict 10 p.m. curfew, and with nothing keeping him in Waterloo anymore, Gacy packed up what little he had left and moved back in with his mother once again. Less than 6 months after his release, on February 12, 1971, he was arrested again after a boy told police that Gacy lured him into his car from a bus stop, took him home and tried to force him to have sex with him. However, the boy disappeared shortly after, so the charges would end up being dropped. Then, just 4 months after this incident, on June 22nd, he was arrested again and charged with aggravated sexual battery and reckless conduct. After a boy went to the police station saying that Gacy pretended to be a sheriff and lured him into his car and forced him to have oral sex. But surprisingly enough, even this wasn't enough to get him charged. Later that year, Gacy and his mother bought a ranch house in Norwich and moved into it. And by August of 1971, Gacy got engaged to Carol Hoff, who had moved into the home with her 2 daughters shortly after they announced the engagement. As they moved in, Gacy's mother moved out, and now it was just him and his new family alone in this house. Gacy had told Carol that he was bisexual, and it was something that she accepted about him. She didn't think that it would matter considering he was marrying her. The two got married on July 1st, 1972, but 3 years later, Carl found him lying and sneaking around. He wouldn't sleep with her or spend any time with her. He'd bring teenage boys into the garage and hide homosexual porn there as well. He was barely spending any time at home, but Carol was smart enough to put two and two together and filed for divorce. But she kept the real reason about him sneaking around with boys a secret. After the divorce, Gacy began focusing on his business, PTM Contractors. The company would provide painting and decorating and maintenance services in the local area, and it actually done really well. They were bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. John Wayne Gacy also liked to fundraise for charities on the side. To do this, he had different tactics, one of which was being Pogo the Clown. He had two clown personalities, Pogo for the happy days and Patches for the sad days. He'd dress up as either depending on how he was feeling that day. At this point, Gacy's hunger for young boys was growing. Even after spending over a year in prison, he didn't want to stop. Instead, knowing what was at stake made him want to assault the boys even more. His victims were always young. Most of them were his own employees. He'd offer them the use of his car for exchange of sexual favours. Sometimes, if they disagreed, he would threaten them by telling them that he had guns and could seriously hurt them if he chose to. One of the first people he assaulted in this part of his life was a teenage employee who had accompanied him on a business trip to Florida. As he went to sleep that night in the hotel, Gacy raped him. They then went back to Chicago the next day and the boy returned to Gacy's house. But when he was there, he attacked him in the yard. But Gacy covered this up by telling his wife that he was a bad employee and didn't want to pay him. 3 years later, Gacy lured a 15-year-old boy named Anthony into his home and got him drunk. Gacy then wrestled Anthony, pinned him to the ground and handcuffed him behind his back. But Gacy made a mistake. Anthony got out of one of the cuffs because it was too loose, and he was able to wriggle his hand out of it. And when Gacy was out of the room, not only did he find the key, but when Gacy came back in, Anthony jumped him and managed to handcuff him instead. Gacy then told him, "Not only are you the only one that got out of the handcuffs, but you got me into them," adding that he was so impressed by this that he was willing to let him go home and forget about the encounter if Anthony just gave him the key. So Anthony did, and he left. Gacy attempted to rape a few more boys before getting even scarier with his crimes. Just assaulting the boys wasn't enough for him anymore. He wanted more. He wanted blood. On January 3rd, 1972, he lured 16-year-old Timothy Jack McCoy into his car from a bus terminal. He took him on a joyride across the city and told him that he would drop him back at the bus terminal the next morning. That night, John Wayne Gacy stabbed Timothy to death in his home. He sat on top of him while he was choking on his own blood and taking his last breath. Gacy says that hearing him gasping for air gave him a mind-numbing orgasm. And this is when he realised that death was the ultimate thrill, and he wanted to do it even more. Before he could move on though, he took Timothy's body and buried it in the crawl space of his home, and later he covered it with concrete so that it would remain there forever. On July 31st, 1975, John Bukovich, an 18-year-old that worked for Gacy, disappeared. He had gone over to Gacy's house to collect his paycheck, but never returned. When his parents started asking around, looking for him, Gacy says that he's probably ran away. John's father called the police over 100 times over the next 3 years, begging them to investigate Gacy. But even with his past of abusing boys, he never got investigated. Gacy had actually strangled John to death and buried him under his garage. Over the next few years, Gacy continued to lure boys into his home or his car, and he would handcuff them, sometimes rape them, but always murder them, continuing to bury them under the crawl space in his house. It seemed like he had the perfect setup. He was picking up boys that were so far away from home. No one had mobile phones, so they couldn't call for help. It seemed as though he would continue to kill forever until the crawl space got full. On December 11th, 1978, Gacy picked up 15-year-old Robert Peast, offering him a job that paid twice the amount that his current job did. He then took him home under the pretense of telling him more about the job. When he got there, he asked Robert, "Is there anything that you wouldn't do for money?" And when Robert says that he didn't mind working hard, Gacy told him that he was about to rape him and that there's nothing he could do to stop it. He then placed a rope around his neck and suffocated him to death. When Robert didn't come home that night, his parents filed a police report. The police found out that a man matching Gacy's description was seen speaking to Robert, and knowing of his history, they went to check things out. He told them that he hadn't seen Robert and that his own uncle had died, so he'll be coming to the station the next day. When he got to the police station early the following morning, he was covered in mud. And he says that he was covered in mud because he got into a car accident. But the police officers found his story weird. So they got a search warrant to go through his home, because at this point they thought that he had Robert trapped in the house and that they could still get him back alive. They didn't know that he was literally killing boys for his sexual gratification. He didn't even need to rape them anymore. He just wanted blood. So the police searched the house on December 13th, and at first they found things like several police badges, a pistol, a syringe, handcuffs and a shitload of drugs, and several different driver's licenses. There was, however, no sign of Robert, so the police kept Gacy under surveillance before getting another search warrant a few days later. On December 19th, the police went back in. This time they had more information about John Wayne Gacy's past, and they were determined to get answers. One officer at the time went to use the bathroom, and when he flushed the toilet, he noticed an odd smell. He instantly suspected that the smell was rotting corpse. The officers suspected that Gacy had been hiding them in the crawlspace under his house, but he needed more proof before they could do anything. Gacy at this point began to panic. He knew that police would eventually figure things out, so he freaked out and confessed to killing Robert to his lawyers, but he strangely told him that his body was in the river. He went on rambling about confessing to killing several other boys and that they were all buried in the crawlspace of his house. When he left the lawyer's office, he confessed to killing 30 or more boys to several other people. So the police had enough evidence to get another search warrant, and this time they went to search the crawlspace. But when police got there on December 21st, they found that Gacy had unplugged the sump pump for the house, and he had let the crawl space get completely flooded. So they had to wait for the water to drain before they could search it. When the water did eventually drain, Daniel Gentry, an evidence technician, went under the crawl space, and even though he was expected to find a few bodies, not even he expected to find what he did. He found a range of rib cages and skulls, all from different boys. He came back out and told police that they could charge him with murder, adding that "I think this crawl space is full of kids." And it was. In total, John Wayne Gacy had murdered 33 boys and buried 29 of them under his home. He eventually drew sketches to show where each of the boys were, and it showed that pretty much no area of the house didn't have a body underneath it. On December 22nd, he confessed to the murder and was charged with them. On April 23rd, 1979, he was found guilty of 33 counts of murder, along with sexual assault and battery. He was sentenced to death for each of these murders. On May 9th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed for his crimes, and with his death, the young boys of Norwich were finally safe, and the 33 that lost their lives finally had justice. John Wayne Gacy lived his life in a way where he literally didn't care about anything or anyone. The way that he died also reflected this. When they were about to execute him, his last words were, "Kiss my ass." To his last breath, he didn't really care about what he had done. He acknowledged it, but never apologised. So guys, that was the story of the monster that was John Wayne Gacy. Let me know in the comment section below what case you would like me to cover next. And if you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And hit that bell icon to be notified every time that I upload a new video. And I will see you all next time. Take care. Bye.